va vous présenter plutôt les résultats de son étude sur single motherhood and child mortality in sub-Saharan Africa en utilisant la perspective des parcours de vie. Elle va faire sa présentation en anglais, mais à la fin, si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, je vais aider à traduire.
Merci beaucoup.
Mais elle comprend très bien.
Une fois.
Québécoise déjà.
Exactement. Okay, I do apologize for presenting in English. And if I go too quickly, which I do in general, feel free to make me go more slowly. But I just want to start by saying that I am genuinely, really delighted to have been invited to come to speak to this group. As we were just discussing, you are just this fabulous whole group of demographers over the hill from us, and it's just lovely to have some engagement. And for me, it's especially lovely because many of you have done or are doing work in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I'm going to do my absolute best to leave some time at the end where I can actually get feedback and questions from you, because I think you will give me very good feedback and questions. So I want to try to leave a little bit of time at the end. And that might come at the expense of me not discussing two sort of related projects, but I'll at least mention them, and then if we have time, I'll go into them in some more detail. But I did just want to present the findings from one of my first. This was sort of my first foray into this area of single motherhood and child well-being more broadly. This paper focuses on child mortality specifically. And I do want to start off by just mentioning that, one of the things that surprised me at first was that if you look at the consequences of single motherhood in North America and Europe, there is simply an enormous amount of research on this topic. How does divorce affect children? How does premarital, childbirth affect children and women? So there's this enormous amount of literature, and overall, this literature suggests that there's a pretty strong negative effect of single motherhood on child well-being. There's currently a fair amount of debate about, how long this negative effect lasts and what are the causes, what are the reasons for this negative effect. But across a very wide domain of different types of measures of child well-being, including cognitive development, educational outcomes, behavioral adjustment, health outcomes, we do see that children who are in single mother households tend to fare worse compared to children whose parents are married. So we do find this. And so, that kind of made me wonder, what are the consequences of single motherhood in sub-Saharan Africa? Basically overall, do children of single mothers, how do children of single mothers fare relative to children whose parents are married? And how many of you, you probably, the most obvious thing, if you just sort of extrapolate, you probably think that they're going to fare worse, right? Most of you, that'd be your first hunch. Few of you would probably guess that they fare better. So, I went to the literature to try to find out, and essentially what we find out is that it's unknown. And one of the reasons it's unknown is that there's very, very little actual research on single motherhood. And instead of doing research on single motherhood, what we find in the literature is a pretty good sum of studies, especially in the 90s in particular, on female-headed households. Right? So you think, oh, well, pretty much the same as single motherhood, so maybe we'll just ask, how do kids in female-headed households fare relative to those in male-headed households? And here's where it starts to get kind of interesting. So one of the more recent studies in South Africa finds absolutely no relationship between the sex of the head of the household and child mortality. A study in Kenya kind of finds mixed results, where children in female-headed households, they're more likely to be stunted, but they're less likely to suffer from wasting. And then, most surprising, we actually find that several, in fact, the majority of studies, typically find a positive association between living in a female-headed household and children's health, especially if they're measuring things like food security and child nutrition. So that makes you kind of scratch your head. Why in the world are these kids living in female-headed households actually, in study after study, doing on average no worse and often actually better than living in male-headed households? And this actually made a lot of people scratch their head and wonder why this is. And there are basically two explanations that people have come up with. One is that, upon further investigation, they actually find out that many of these female-headed households are actually richer than male-headed households. Why? Because some people, not all researchers do this, some of them exclude this, but some researchers actually include in their definition of female-headed households, households where the husband or the male has migrated, and he's sending back remittances to the household. So not surprisingly, if you have, someone who's sending back remittances to your household, you're going to be wealthier. I actually think the second one is actually the main reason why we're so likely to find that female-headed households are wealthier. And this has to do with the fact that female-headed householdship is always measured in these kind of cross-sectional, surveys where they just ask who's the current head of the household. And what happens in that phenomena is that you only pick up those households that are able to survive. So if you are, if you become a female head of household, but because you don't have the economic means to sustain yourself and presumably your children, what will happen is that your household will actually just dissolve. Or what you may do is you may move either with your children or your children may go in another household into another household and become what some people have referred to as subfamilies or disguised female-headed households. But if you move into, say, your father's household, or let's say you even get remarried, that now gets counted as a male-headed household. And so what you're doing really by doing these cross-sectional measures of female-headed households is you're only picking up the survivors, the ones who are able to have the economic resources to sustain themselves and their children, and you're missing some of the families that are maybe most disadvantaged. The other explanation that's put forward in the literature and that's become more contentious recently, but is still referred to quite often, is that it also may be possible that even if female-headed households and male-headed households had the same income, their kids still might be healthier or better off because women might be more likely to direct a higher proportion of household expenditure, household resources, towards their children, right? So the other possible explanation of why it would be that kids in female-headed households are doing better is that it may be that women direct a higher proportion of the resources towards their kids than in male-headed households. But basically, both of these possible explanations essentially have led both myself and many other researchers, actually many very vocal researchers, to decide that female-headed householdship is a really bad measure. It is not the same as single motherhood, and we really do need a better measure. And what I'm going to propose today is that we actually do look at single motherhood, and we not only look at single motherhood, but we look at single motherhood over the life course. That is, we look at it as a dynamic measure and not just as a static measure. So that's what I'm going to propose today. And of course, with any measure, we need a definition. So I'm going to, for the purposes of today, define a single mother as a woman who is not in a union or a marriage and who has at least one child under the age of 15. And let me also just, as many of you who work in Africa will say, what is a marriage in Africa? What's a union in Africa? We are using DHS, and we're just using this self-reported definition of marriage and union. So that's how it's being defined for purposes of today, but we could spend a long time talking about whether or not that alone is a good indicator or not. The other thing I want to point out, though, about single motherhood is that you can sort of think that there are kind of two main pathways into single motherhood. That is, there are two main ways that a woman is going to become a single mother. The first way, which has received a bit more attention, is what I refer to as premarital single motherhood. That is, before her first marriage, so never married women give birth. And that's one way that she's going to become a single mother. The second way, which receives virtually, not no attention, but much less attention, is postmarital single motherhood. And these are formally married people. So women who have been in a marriage but are no longer in a marriage because they were divorced or widowed. But at the time when they get divorced or widowed, they still have at least one child under the age of 15. So I'm going to refer to those as premarital single motherhood and postmarital single motherhood. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'll use this terminology a lot. Okay. So there are two main pathways into single motherhood. And we're going to basically today, since there is relatively little research on this phenomena in sub-Saharan Africa, we're really going to ask just two questions. First of all, how common is it for women to experience at least one episode of being either a premarital or postmarital single motherhood? That is, how common is it for women to spend at least some part of time where they have at least one child under 15? And then the second question is, what are the effects of single motherhood on child mortality rates? Okay, so what's the relationship between women's marital status and whether or not their children make it till the age of 5? So to answer these questions, we are going to use the demographic and health survey data. We're going to select recent surveys where child mortality exceeds 6%. In the first 6 countries in black there, those are sort of your standard DHS surveys. I think many of you were probably at Simona's talk, so you either independently or through that talk became somewhat familiar with these very popular data sets. And, you know, it's easy to criticize the DHS because they don't do everything for all of us. But in fact, in this particular regard, it's pretty clear that they are fairly limited. So what all DHS ask are these full birth histories. So we know when the kids were born and we know when the kids died, if they died. However, the questions around marriage in the standard DHS are very limited. Typically, you have 3 questions: her marital status at the time of the survey, the number of previous unions, and the age at which she got married, or the date that she got married. So we're pretty limited. It's very difficult from that to reconstruct a full birth history. And the thing that's really conspicuously missing is that we don't have the date for when a union ended for any of the unions, and we don't have the dates for when if she's in a second union or third union, we have no idea when that might have begun. Fortunately, a handful, and I really mean only a handful, of DHS do collect these marital history calendar data, and these are the countries in blue here. And what that does, this is, you say, what is a marital history calendar? Well, here's a little picture of an abbreviated version of it. So basically, it goes back to January, 5 years before the survey. And all it does is it simply tells me in each month for those preceding 5 to 6 years, was the woman in a union or not in a union, right? So now at least we know when, during those 5 years, when a union ended and when a new union started, at least for that time period. So it seems like only a little bit more information, but it turns out to be extremely useful. Okay, so turning back to our first question, how common is it for women to experience an episode of premarital or postmarital single motherhood over the life course? It's important to remember when we're looking at this question, this is a question about women, about how likely they are to become single mothers. So this is a woman-level analysis, and we're using data from the women. If you guys do have questions, feel free. I don't mind being interrupted, so feel free to go ahead and ask questions during the talk. Okay, so what we're going to do with answering question 1, the first thing we want to do is to just look at the cumulative probability that she becomes a premarital single mom. That is, that she has a birth before her first marriage. The nice thing about this is that because all DHS ask us questions about her age when she first got married, and we know the date when the first kid was born, for all DHS we can determine this. Okay, and we can use all women, and it's fairly straightforward. We're going to use competing risk models where the risk is either she has a birth or she has a marriage first, right? And depending if she has the birth first, then we mark her as becoming a premarital single mom. And of course, for women who neither have a birth or have a child yet, she's treated as censored at the time of the survey. So these are actually fairly straightforward and can be done with all DHS. What is much harder to do is to get the cumulative probability that she's going to become a postmarital single mom. Now remember, we have no idea when unions end in the standard DHS, so we can't use those data at all. We're restricted only to those countries where we have, to the 5 countries where we have marital history data. And even then, even though we have the marital history data, because they only go back 5 or 6 years, even then we don't have complete marital histories for between 8% of women in Kenya and 19% of women in Ethiopia. And one way to think about this is that for those women, their union histories are left truncated. And so what we have to do is we use a Kaplan-Meier survival function, but we use it with late entry. And essentially what we're doing is we're modeling the risk of a union ending only for those women, only for that time period. We can only use basically the data that women are exposed during the calendar date. So getting these cumulative post-marital single motherhood measures are a bit trickier. But they can be done because at least we have the calendar data. Okay. Are we good on the methods and kind of the data? Because, as many of you know, actually working with these data, there's a lot of, the devil's in a lot of the detail of these particular data, but we're doing our best that we can with the limited data available. Okay, so using the data from the standard DHS, as I mentioned, we can estimate premarital single motherhood. If we look here and we start with Nigeria, what you can see, and this is what you would totally expect, is that starting shortly before age 15 and sort of plateauing around age 25, we do see a rise in the likelihood that she becomes a premarital single mom. But at the end of the day, even by age 45 here, we see that only about 10% of women become a premarital single mom. In the Congo, you see it's a bit higher. By the time we're in Ghana, we're all the way a little bit over 15%. In Sierra Leone, we're probably up to about 25%. Well, maybe Zambia is up at about 25%. And finally, in Liberia, you're all the way up at 35%. So one thing to note about these is that there's a lot of variation across sub-Saharan Africa in rates of premarital single motherhood. We do see that there's a lot of contrast. Of course, in all countries, again, it's mainly concentrated in those years sort of between 13 and 25. But exactly how many women are likely to become premarital single moms varies quite considerably across these countries. Okay, so for the other 5 countries where we have the marital history calendars, we are able to estimate both premarital and postmarital single motherhood. We're going to start again with the country with the lowest, which is Ethiopia. And you see here that if you look at the green line, which is the premarital single motherhood, it's actually very low in Ethiopia. It's our lowest country. 5% of women give birth before marriage in Ethiopia. So you see it's really uncommon. However, postmarital single motherhood is not all that common. This really is only going up to age 45, and even by then you have a quarter of women experiencing postmarital single motherhood. And for all of these measures of postmarital single motherhood, if we actually kept going at older ages, that would continue to rise. So, we're actually stopping at a fairly young age for these. But by age 45, what we find in Ethiopia is that about 30% of women are likely to experience some form of single motherhood. And so the blue there is the total line. In Kenya, we see that the rates are much, much higher, right? And what's interesting about Kenya is that the rates of premarital single motherhood are really quite high. So again, if you look at the green bar, you see that about 30% of women are going to become single mothers through having a premarital birth alone. And then slightly over 30% are also going to enter into single motherhood through becoming either divorced or widowed, right? So in total in Kenya, 60% of women can expect to spend at least some part of their life being an unmarried mother with children under 15. In Malawi, this kind of forms an interesting contrast to Kenya, because in Kenya, where the premarital and postmarital single motherhood rates were about the same, what you see here in Malawi is that the premarital rates are quite considerably lower, at least relative to the postmarital single motherhood rates. The postmarital single motherhood rates alone are going to be 50%, and then the total likelihood that you're going to become a premarital or a single mother is around 60% in Malawi. So even though the overall likelihood is the same, in Kenya it's split about 50-50, and in Malawi it's clearly dominated by postmarital single motherhood. The picture for Tanzania is just about the same, but the overall rates are a smidgen lower, where the overall rates are, I say only, but only about 50%. But the pattern looks somewhat similar to Malawi. And in Zimbabwe, what we see is again a similar pattern to Tanzania and Malawi, where postmarital single motherhood is much more common. But, this is our highest rate for our country. And in the end, in Zimbabwe, by the age of 45, 70% of women will experience some time as a single mother. And this number just continues, to kind of surprise me and sort of make me pause, partly because I think that you know, once you get into the realm of something being 70%, there's a 70% chance of likelihood, you have to start thinking that's really more the norm. And the exception is the women who get married, have kids, and stay married throughout the time that they are raising those kids. And I wonder how much, you know, young girls in these countries kind of think about that when they think about their futures. There's going to be some point in my life where I'm going to be unmarried and have kids that I presumably need to support. And I wonder even more how much policymakers are considering this, particularly through postmarital single motherhood. There is, of course, some policy attention around premarital birth and teenage birth and, you know, schoolgirl birth, you know, pregnancy, yada, yada. There is policy attention on that, but there's very little policy attention on the fact that that the majority of these single moms are actually going to become single moms through divorce or widowhood. Yes, Kwate.
Who were in both states?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So we actually do, the total rate is actually just a total rate. So if she both entered into a premarital, you know, she had a birth before marriage, and then she also got divorced, let's say. She doesn't count twice in our total rate. So if you just add these two up, it's actually always slightly higher than our total rate. So we're not including it in our total rate. So we did actually run, put in the regression models when we were looking at predictors of postmarital single motherhood, we put in a variable saying she was a premarital single mom. And we do find that that is a significant predictor of becoming a postmarital single mom. But as you can see, you know, the total is slightly lower than the sum of the two, but it's not dramatically lower, right? So it's, you know, the total is just, you experience one episode. It's not counting women who experience two episodes twice. Does that answer your question?
In relation to the probability, when you then look at the probability, you assume that they are independent. I mean, that the probability of having a premarital is not related to the probability of having a postmarital. I mean, if she is murdered prematurely and then get married,
right? And in fact, we show that they're not independent. There is, if you have a premarital birth, you're more likely to also end up being a postmarital single mom. However, when we calculate the probability for the total, as soon as the first experience of single motherhood, she gets counted as a single mom, but then she's no longer at risk of having the episode get repeated, right? So we're not in that case, we're just interested in sort of what's your first episode of becoming a single mom. We're not kind of counting twice the fact that she had a premarital birth and then got divorced.
And then got divorced.
Yeah, exactly. Which clearly does happen. I mean, it clearly is the case that, you know, especially I think that, you know, you see these women, well, I can talk more because I've been doing work more on qualitative trying to understand, but, you know, you do see that women who have kids from previous partners seem to have slightly less stable unions with new partners who are not the biological fathers of those kids. And so you do see that, especially around divorce, those unions tend to be less stable. But I also do just want to point out that cumulative probability for the total is actually a total. Like, I really can make the statement that 70% of women in Zimbabwe will experience at least one episode of being a single mom, even though they're not independent.
In many places, I mean, in some society, premarital birth is not necessarily it's sort of like the transition, it's sort of way to get married in many cases, in which case it's not as bad, or it's not even bad in, you know, I mean, so. Right.
So we actually did rerun some of our numbers, especially around premarital births, where what we did, and again, this is based on the literature of sort of this notion that, you know, usually, especially if you get married within 6 months of the birth of that kid, you're probably marrying the father of that kid. And it probably is part of the marital process. So we did actually rerun our estimates where we took out, you know, those people who got married within 6 months. We did not count those as having a premarital birth. And in my regression results, I never count those as premarital births either. And it actually doesn't change our numbers all that much. But you're absolutely right that, you know, we did deal with this issue of premarital birth. So they needed to you know, be sort of not, you know, living without the partner for at least 6 months to be counted as having a premarital birth. Yeah.
I think one of the problems you're stuck with your data, the DHS
Yes,
data,
we're stuck
which
with
is
our
really
data.
limited.
Yeah.
Bilempo and her work showed that a divorce and a veuvage, becoming a widow, have very, very different effects.
Yep.
That if you are divorced, you lose a lot of the help of your family. If you're widowed, you maintain it. And you probably can't distinguish that with DHS
We are
data.
going to do the best we can in about 2 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
But here you have a special problem because Zimbabwe has a huge AIDS rate.
Right.
And quite possibly, a lot of this is due to husbands dying from AIDS, and chances are fairly high that the mother is sick also, and that this may end up affecting the child, and that you have a very different dynamic going on.
Yes. It's an excellent point. I'm going to just hold off until I actually get to the divorce and widowhood. And you'll see, and we are taking these data to their absolute, we are pushing them hard in order to, because while all we know is that, in this case, all we know is that the union ended. We can't figure out, is it a divorce or a widowhood unless she doesn't remarry. And then we can use her current marital status to say, okay, so she hasn't remarried, so I'm going to be able to say this was a divorce, this was widowhood. And actually, in all of these countries, including Zimbabwe, because the main difference in this, this totally puzzled us for a while too, but the main difference is actually we're only going up to age 45. And in the majority of these, you actually see that it's divorce, not widowhood. That's far more common. That's really driving this. You think, oh, well, 45, that's, they certainly do have widows, but, the widowhood rate really starts going up sort of after 45. And so the majority of these are actually divorce cases. I can also show you a slide at the end where we use the Nairobi DSS data, and you'll also see that really divorce rates are trumping these widowhood rates in most of this. And in the analysis, which I'm going to get to now, we do our very best to actually distinguish between those, but not initially because it involves more guesswork. Yeah. Okay, so on to the second question. What are the effects of single motherhood on child mortality rates? And just to point out, we're now switching to a child level analysis, right? Our outcome variable is, does the child die or not in a particular month? We're going to use random effects discrete-time logit models, where we're going to take the log odds of the hazard rate that child I of mother J dies in time T. And the time period here, remember, is a month. So we're going to follow kids from birth until either they die or until the time of the survey. In these regressions, we include a host of what we know are really critical predictors of child mortality, including mother's characteristics, how old she is at the time of the birth, her educational attainment. We're going to look at child characteristics, including their sex, their birth order, preceding birth intervals, did a previous sibling die, and our time function indicator is going to be the child's age, and mu is taking into account mother level random effects, because we are allowing for, if a woman has more than one child born in the last 5 to 6 years, we put in both children. So we just account for that in a random effects. However, the variable that we actually really care about is this marital status variable, right? And that's, of course, the most difficult one to measure, because what we really want is something where we know mom's marital status for each and every month of that kid since birth or until we stop observing them, right? For the regular DHS, this is a bit of a pipe dream, but we do our best again. There are 2 categories that we can actually identify, even with a normal DHS, with certainty, or as much certainty as one has in self-reported data like this. One of them is that mom is continuously married. So we know, for example, that if we know when she first got married, we know when the kid was born after that, and that mom has stayed in this first marriage, she's counted as continuously married, and even with regular DHS, we can determine that. We also can determine those women who have never been married. So mom has a child, but she has never entered into a union. We know that she's never been married for any part of that child's life, okay? What we don't know is that if mom is divorced or widowed, or she's remarried or newly married at the time of the survey, we don't know when this happened. And so we know her status at the time of the survey, but we don't know, for example, did she get divorced before the kid died, or did she get divorced after the kid died? And with remarriage, we don't even know if she got remarried before the kid was born or after the kid was born. And that can make a really big difference, because in one case, the kid's likely to be the biological kid of her current partner, and in the other case, the kid is likely not to be the biological father or the biological child of her current partner. So that can make a really big difference. So when I talk about these surveys with the standard DHS, especially for the formerly married and the remarried, we're really just looking at associations, and that's as far as we can get, and that's really important to bear in mind. With the marital history calendars, we can, in fact, go a little bit further. The categories in black we can identify with a fair amount of certainty and from the perspective of the child. So we know when mom's union ended and that she became formally married. We also know when she might have entered into a new union, and we can identify this again from the perspective of the child, that this is someone who is unlikely to be the biological father of the child. So we can identify that. Now the tricky part here gets to Tom's question, which is that we don't know, because we know the union ended, but we don't know if it ended in divorce or by divorce or widowhood. At the time of the survey, we know her current status. So we know if she is divorced or widowed at the time of the survey. So again, if during that union history in the last 5-6 years, the union ends, she never enters a new union, time of the survey she's divorced, safe assumption to say that union ended in divorce, right? So for the majority and sort of by the end, we can kind of guess what category they're in. Where we still are missing data, however, and really just there's nothing we can do about this, is that if mom ends a union, she's, her status is unknown, 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 and then she gets remarried. So at the end of the survey, her status is remarried. But we know that there was some time interval in there when she was formerly married. But in that case, it's anyone's guess whether or not that other union ended in divorce or in widowhood, right? So in the analyses, I'm literally going to have a category, formerly married, unknown, for those months intervening. But what's interesting about that group is what we do know about that group is that they eventually do end in a remarriage, okay? So the time period we're marking, she's not remarried, but we know that eventually she is going to get remarried. So we'll see those results in a minute. But let's first just look at the regular DHS. If you look at the bars in yellow here, those are the never married women. And again, those are the ones we actually feel we're measuring fairly accurately, or at least in the right chronological order for even with the regular DHS. And the reference group here are these moms who are continuously married, presumably to the child's biological father. And what you see is that of these 6 countries, we have sort of 3 that we find that compared to mom and dad are married to each other. If mom has never been married, that is, she had a premarital birth, we find that kids are significantly more likely to die. And in the DRC, we find that it's significant at the 10% level. So we do find, at least in some countries, and these are fairly, they're not enormous effects, but we're looking at anywhere between sort of 30% and 50% increases in the odds of these kids dying for a premarital birth. Even more consistent is and here, check out the word, association between being formerly married and the child dying. And here what we actually find in that in all countries except for Ghana, there is a very strong association between mom being formerly married and between her kid being more likely to die. However, let me just restate, we do not know. It is possible, for example, that the reason that mom is formerly married is because the child actually died before the union ended. Okay? And then lastly, if we look at the category of remarriage, we also see that in many of the countries, in 5 of the 6, all except for Zambia, we find that children whose mothers are remarried are significantly associated with being more likely to die. And I actually find this really surprising because remember, some of these kids in this measure may actually be the biological kids of these fathers. So I find this rather surprising and really wanted to look at that when we're able to use our better data where we can actually sort out at least the chronological order of when the child died and when mom changed her union status using a time-varying measure of mom's marital status. So when we do that, the results in many ways are actually somewhat similar. In about half the countries, we find that being born before the first marriage is associated with a significant increase in the likelihood that the child dies. Those are, again, the yellow bars. And then we find that in, 4 of these 5 countries, being formerly married is very clearly associated and precedes, I should say, the higher likelihood that the child is going to die. So we do find, even using this better measure of formerly married, that there is a pretty clear and strong association across most of the countries that those kids are going to be more likely to die. Lastly, we see a little bit less evidence that remarriage is going to be associated with being more likely to die. But I will point out here that because we're excluding all those kids, this is a smaller group now. This has to be to a new man, someone who's not the kid's biological father. So it's a relatively small group. So they're all positive, but they're only significant in 2 countries. In Ethiopia, it's very large, but it's a very small group, so don't get too carried away with that one. And in Malawi, we do find some evidence that being in a new relationship is associated with higher mortality for these kids. So I know you all do want to know, though, yeah, but the formerly married, is it divorce or is it widowhood? So how many of you think that my results, even though I kind of gave this away a little bit, but my results for being formerly married are primarily driven because, as Tom correctly points out, death is clustered within households. If dad dies, mom might also be sick, especially with HIV. The child may actually also have HIV, or maybe mom can't breastfeed, etc. So we know we find this clustering of death within households, and that's only magnified with diseases like HIV, where they're transmitted within the family. So it seems, wouldn't most of you think that probably my formerly married, that these results, even though I told you that divorce is actually the most common state for these women under 45, the reason we're finding that the formerly married kids, the kids with formerly married moms are more likely to die is because of divorce or widowhood. Yeah?
Where you are in Africa. In the Sahel, where you don't have a lot of AIDS, divorce is probably worse because it's much more badly viewed and you lose a lot of the support of your family. And a widowhood, you maintain the support of the wider family. Mm-hmm. So I would think that it would be associated. So
you think that there would be regional differences? So
yes.
In the Sahel, widowhood or divorce is going to be marginally worse than widowhood, and in the AIDS belt, you're going to find that. Okay, well, let's take a closer look. And again, these are only associational, but they still think that they're somewhat revealing. And we can look through these by sort of regions, but you do find, in fact, that divorce overall, is more significant. It's more often significant. In fact, here, widowhood is never significant, whereas divorce is significant in 4 of these countries and at 10% in Zambia. So what's really sort of driving the formerly married does appear to be these divorced women, not the widowed women. Although, again, the category for widowed is small in some of these countries. And so could I make an argument that in a place like the Congo or Liberia, in fact, those would be significant if we had a bigger sample size? One possibly could, right? But as it is, what's clearly driving our association with the data with formerly married is actually these divorced women. And then when we're able to take an even better look using the retrospective data from the marital history calendar, what we see here is, again, that it really appears that divorce, which is in the dark blue here, is the one that is significant, again, in 4 of these 5 countries. And I don't know. Tom, we should really think through this it would be neat to do this by regional, because certainly in a place like Ethiopia, that's where you see one of the biggest differences between divorce and widowhood. And there too, it's not a very high prevalence of AIDS, but divorce might be highly stigmatized, right? So it really would be kind of interesting. Whereas in Zimbabwe, you actually, you don't see a significant effect for either. What are we missing there? Yeah, you don't see anything for divorce, and you do see some for widowhood, but it's not significant. But overall, the ones that are mainly significant across these countries tend to be divorce, even in some of these countries with high HIV rates. And again, that might just be because more of the women are divorced, and so we might just have too small of a sample size among our widows. Yes, Simona.
Question. I'm not sure that in this phase of the DHS, actually, that question was asked, but so it would have to be checked. But now in the household questionnaire, every member of the household, which would include the woman in your case, is asked whether they are chronically ill or not.
Uh-huh.
So I wonder, I mean, if she is widowed, I mean, you could check. I mean, if you think that the pathway goes through the fact that she's sick and, you know, maybe the kids are sick, I mean, it would be...
I've gone one step similar to that. Not beyond, but similar. Actually, in several of these countries, including Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Kenya, we actually know her HIV status. So I've actually matched mom's HIV status with this and controlled for HIV status, and these results are actually controlling for HIV status, but they don't actually change much with or without mom's HIV status. But absolutely, I mean, you know, you do sort of think like, what's going on with widowhood? And, you know, we do also have kind of this image of the plight of women and their children, whereas the plight of divorced women and their children, not as much kind of awareness and attention. Yeah.
Possibility is your data are censored and they're lousy quality. And by that, I mean that the DHS interviewer shows up. The husband's dead. The woman is really sick. And you say, this is irrespectful. I'm not going to ask the questions. You go to the next one. No. And you're just systematically underrepresenting women and their children who are in that situation.
Yeah. Well, and you are absolutely, no question, underrepresenting women who have died. Right? So women who have died, no, but really, right? I'm serious. And so, you know, those women are more likely to have been widowed first. And so if she gets widowed and there's only a small window in which it's, you know, she's widowed, but then she dies shortly thereafter, which happens all the time, she is out, right? So we're kind of underrepresenting widows by definition because they're more likely to die, and we don't interview, well, at the moment, we're not interviewing women who have died. So yeah, no, there's no question about it. That's absolutely one of the limitations. And there are, I mean, and all of the DHS, and, you know, and as I started off saying, you know, you can blame them and criticize. I mean, they're kind of, in many ways, the best thing we've got. But, you know, there's also a lot of evidence of birth displacement, of date and birth displacement. There, you know, where kids suddenly, especially around, because they ask in conjunction with, you know, the last 5 years, they ask a lot of health questions, and then they displace the kids to be slightly older so they don't have to do this whole other module on health. And there's tons of evidence that that actually goes on, right? So this, you know, all of these do have to be taken into consideration with possible misreporting. But the one last thing I do just want to point out that I also find just fascinating is that the highest and strongest bars tend to actually be in those women who we don't know if they're widowed or divorced, but we do know that they eventually get remarried. And to me, this is clear evidence of selection effect into remarriage or new unions if you don't have kids from previous unions or you don't have living kids. Right? Because remember in the first slide, we see these really high, strong results about getting remarried and how that's associated with the child dying. I think that these results here suggest that really what's going on is that the kid dies before mom gets into this new relationship, and that if she doesn't have living kids from previous unions, she's way more likely to enter into a new relationship. That's how I read these, which may be reading a bit much into them, but that's what I would interpret them. And I think that they are fascinating, that they're actually such a strong effect here. Okay, so basically, really quickly, in conclusions, I just want to note that if current trends continue, we're going to see between 30 and 70% of women in these countries can expect to become a single mom before their 45th birthday. These numbers compare, very dramatically, I think, to just current estimates of who's a female-headed household. So I also just did those in these data, and it's between 13 and 20%. So, in terms of magnitude of women that we're talking about and the likelihood, you see that looking at a life course perspective, of course, gives you larger numbers. There's a lot of variation in the likelihood of becoming a premarital single mother, ranging from only 5% in Ethiopia to 35% in Liberia, but that the most common way in most countries, except for Kenya, of becoming a single mom is actually through divorce or widowhood. And generally, it is more common that you become a single mom through divorce than through widowhood. And then in terms of conclusions for question 2, I would note that in about half of the countries, children whose moms were never married, these premarital births, are significantly more likely to die before the age of 5 compared to kids whose biological parents are married. But in the vast majority of cases, 9 out of 11, it's really these kids of these formerly married moms who are most at risk. and who are more likely to die, again, compared to kids whose parents are married. And in all 9 of these 11 countries, it's the divorced mothers that is significantly associated with the kids dying, and not widowhood that's significantly associated with moms dying, or with kids dying. There's only 1 country where the children of widowed mothers are actually significantly more likely to die, with the caveats that we talked about sample size and selection and those kind of things. So these findings suggest that measures of mothers' union status are better predictors of child mortality than female-headed households. And I guess if there are kind of like takeaway messages I would emphasize is that first, single motherhood is common, especially through divorce or widowhood, that it is pretty consistently associated with poor outcomes for children, like child mortality, and that most importantly for PhD students, this single motherhood method is really not acceptable. You know, we've used it for a long time. I've used it before. Some of you in the room may have used it before, but we need to move beyond it. You know, it really doesn't capture a vulnerable group of women and children, and that we should start thinking about other ways of identifying women and children at risk. So those are my main conclusions. I think I want to pause to let you ask some more questions, but I also can talk about slides about other limitations about this study and also new work that I'm doing. But I'll pause for now. Oh, thank you.
Just a very quick question. You said in 9 countries, you have children of divorced mother who are at risk of dying. What if actually it's because the child died and the woman was blamed for and kicked out of the,
exactly.
You know, because several years ago when I was looking at surveys which were carried out in different African countries, the so-called IFOR surveys, one of the things which was consistently found in all countries was that women or family which usually change residence partly because of the death of the child. So you have a attrition which was in part the cause of changing residence. So right the way. Yeah. And then in this case where you have divorce, it's sort of say, you know, what's the part of divorce which is actually due to child death, and then the woman is accused of, just like it used to be the case that when there was a problem of sterility, it's always the woman to be blamed that she can't produce children, so she's kicked out of the house, then the child died. Okay, so
right. No, I mean absolutely. And so I should be a little more cautious actually in saying 9 of the 11. And what I really in the first 6 countries, you're absolutely right. It is you can equally interpret it as kids whose mom is divorced are more likely to die, or because the kid died, mom's more likely to get divorced. But in the last 5 countries, you can't interpret it that way, because we know we can actually time that the divorce happened before the kid died. So
misplacement of
right, there might be misplacement, and she might misremember, or
you put 6-month window, but sometimes 6 months is like a year. People say, okay,
and also the kid could have been sick for a long time, and even the sickness of the kid could have been blamed on mom, and so yeah, I mean
one of the things just quickly was sort of look at rural-urban differentials in those things, because if we expect some of those things, Tom was talking about things happening in certain areas than others, if we are serious, we want to look at what is happening in rural versus urban areas, because it's really the picture. I mean, even the notion of divorce in rural areas is completely different, the exposure, the vulnerabilities, and so on. So it's sort of putting together like this and present at the national level, sort of put things in a very difficult way of interpreting or even understanding actually what is happening. And I think just by going through some of those basic things, rural, urban, and looking at culture.
I do control for urban and rural, which I didn't mention. But no, actually separating the analysis, and that would also be, that could also shed insights into this kind of the cultural differences about how women are treated with divorce or widowhood, and that could be really interesting. That's a great idea. Yeah, Tom.
You have a real interesting question. You have real interesting results, but it's awfully hard to give any meaningful interpretation to them, in the sense that what really interests you is to saying, are children of single women at higher risk? But why would they be at higher risk? There are things that, ways that child health and mortality affects being in marriage, marriage affects child status, and there are huge contextual differences. If I'm thinking about not the first part, about never married woman, in Muslim countries, I think once a woman is known to be pregnant, she's not allowed to get married until she has birth. So a lot of times there may be a fiancé. You're just not going to get married until the birth comes along, and it's going to be defined as a single birth. And in another context, that would not occur. You've got all of these problems that are very context specific. And I was just thinking, how would I try and do it? I'd say, you control for socioeconomic status. But maybe the effect of single motherhood is via socioeconomic status. If you control for it, you're ruining the entire, you're taking out one of the main mechanisms. If you don't control for it, you may be not controlling for something that's an important confounding variable. It's really complicated to draw out true causal effects.
No, I think you've summed up this whole study very nicely. And I really, I think I'll defend it in saying that I think I'm pointing to an area that's under-researched. I'm showing a potentially strong link, and I'm hoping that it stimulates future research to really tease out both the cultural context, which, was sort of what Quate was getting at in these sort of more detail, but even at the very basic level of these causal mechanisms. And so, I would say that, we can say absolutely nothing about the causal mechanisms going, why in the world is it that, I've sort of pointed this thing out that there's this really strong association with the single motherhood and child mortality, but why I really cannot answer with these data. I can speculate, and we can probably, speculate as a group, which would actually be very helpful for me. Certainly in the context of this very big literature in the West on the issue of single, why is it the kids of single moms in the West do less well? Poverty is the major explanation. It accounts for about 50% of the difference in, and these are much better studies with longitudinal data, often with divorce, where they can actually follow and say, the woman's household wealth was here. It usually drops by about 50% after she's divorced, and accounting for that drop in wealth accounts for about 50% of the effect of being a single mom on these kids. So poverty is going to be a major potential mechanism. If I really were being honest with you, I'd also tell you I actually don't even know where a lot of these kids live. I don't know where most of them live, because the lovely DHS asks you where the kid lives if the kid's alive, but if the kid's died, we have no idea where they lived. So I can't include it as a variable, right? And no doubt about it, I think that, the other thing is that if a woman has a premarital birth, that kid may go and live with grandma. If the woman enters into a new union, there is a lot, Carolyn Bledsoe does document in Sierra Leone, I think. Is that what she was doing? Yeah, does document very clearly that kids from previous unions go and live, they're fostered out, right? They go and live with other relatives instead of going with mom. So I don't even know that with these data. And then the other thing, is the role of other kin in either, and this, relates to you. Well, first of all, what's the role of father? Because the assumption here, she's not married and dad's just out of the picture. And certainly in South Africa, and this is where one of my other projects is, that's not true, especially for the premarital unions. It's very common, at least in South Africa, for young men and women to be in a partnership. They just don't live together, and she still lives with mom and dad, and he's actually trying to make money that he sends back to her and the kids, but they've never been married, and she's going to be counted as a single mom to me. And then there's the whole question about extended kin. When do they help out? Under what circumstances do they help out? And what kind of support do they actually provide? And so, to me, I think this study kind of points to a lot of interesting future research, and the poverty question in particular is what I'm looking at using the data from Nairobi, from the Nairobi Urban DHSS, and what's fascinating here, and these are very preliminary results, known as we just submitted them to IUSSP and put it in as the first abstract, so who knows. But what's fascinating to me is that these we actually do. We have both qualitative and we have longitudinal quantitative data about women's wealth measurements. And again, we're still working on sort of making sure that these results hold. But what's really interesting in that is that in contrast to the West, we find very clearly that these single mothers are poor, no doubt about it. They're about 30% poorer than women who are married, even in these slum communities, right? So they are really the poorest of the poor. However, poverty itself is not correlated with child mortality in these urban slums. Go figure. All of our measures and any change in wealth status does not account for at all why it is that these kids of these single moms are more likely to die. We do, however, confirm our results for Kenya as a whole in this slum area that kids of single moms are more likely to die in the slum areas, like in Kenya as a whole, but it seems not to be due to poverty. And what we're finding, or what we think we're finding from the qualitative data, is that a lot of it does have to do with the role of fathers and how much they're actually involved with their kids, and that these single moms in these slums are really actually, instead of being supported by their parents or by other kin, the single moms, both the premarital ones and the divorced ones, are often sent to Nairobi to make money for the rest of the family. So they're not receiving funds from the family. They're expected to provide funding and at the same time take care of their kids. And their neighbors really shun them a lot. There's a lot of discrimination. We get a lot of qualitative reports from these single moms that the other mothers mock them, and that they won't let their kids play with their kids. And this is true. This seems to be true simply because they're not married, and not just, there is some, discussion that all single women, all single moms in particular, are very promiscuous. Some of our single moms, 3 of the 15 are in fact sex workers, but the rest aren't, or they claim not to be, and yet they're still perceived as being very promiscuous and really shunned by their neighbors. And so what I would like to argue is that the causal mechanism, at least in the urban slum in Nairobi, is not economic, but rather these social factors. And I think that would be really fascinating to kind of dig into a little more and to try to understand a little better. But I agree. I mean, we just, I think we're pointing to something interesting, and we can't, at the moment, we can't say why. But, thank goodness, we got to have something to do. Any other questions?
You spoke too fast. That's
I know. Am I over? Well, okay. Do you want me to tell you about my CAPS area study
yes,
too? Oh, okay. All right. So this is the other thing. This is the poverty and role of so the CAPS area study. Although, what time are we ending? We originally said 11:50, right?
Last week, right? So our seminar series normally ends at 10 to 1 because we need to, when we are in the cell, we need to free the room by 10 to 1. Here, 6 is very nice to us, and so they let us stay for, if we want, until 1:15. So
especially coming from the other side of the
who
town.
has to leave and who can stay. I mean,
You
but
feel
if
free to
somebody has
leave.
to leave, please feel free. I mean, Shelley obviously has many more slides.
I can keep talking. Don't worry. Is that yeah? Feel free to leave if you want to leave. But
1:15.
Okay. So I'll talk a little bit. I actually I'm so fascinated by this study. I should mention. I also just want to mention, just to give them credit, that the part of the study in Nairobi is done with Hermaine Boko, who some of you may remember is coming from your program, and he's been working with these data with me. But this one on the role of fathers, and this is in South Africa, which, as you do know, is a very, very different context really from a lot of the rest of Africa in general. And it's my first time working in this area. So I've been working with Latricia Martelletto, thank you, Martelletto, and we've been sort of trying to understand through these data. The CAPS study is, for those of you who are looking for data in South Africa, they are actually really remarkable data. They're longitudinal studies that were now, the 5th wave was just published. So we have several waves of these data that follow young adults, and they sort of mainly, are kind of capturing things like transitions to adulthood and economic earnings and education. But they do, now that these young adults have started having kids, well, they've had kids for a while actually, they do actually ask many questions about the children of these young adults. And the best thing I think about this CAP study is that they ask the young men and the young women about their fertility histories and their relationship to their children, right? So for a few times we actually get to glimpse a little bit at men, and particularly young men's, sort of fertility and their relationship to their children and their childbearing, and their parenting, really, of these young men. And these are again preliminary findings, but some of them I think are really quite striking. So there's been a lot coming out of South Africa about is marriage over, the demise of marriage, and that we don't really, that fathers are really just are no longer part of the sort of parenting and reproductive sort of process, and that it's really mothers and grandmothers who are raising these children, and that we see a lot of the sort of matrilineal lines of raising children. And you often hear things like conjugal ties are much weaker than consanguineous, meaning that the blood ties to kin are much more strong, and that the relationships between parents or husbands and wives is very weak, right? So these findings actually kind of, in some ways, speak a little bit against this, because much of what we see reported are things like this first figure, that only 26% of young fathers co-reside with their children. So figures like that do tend to kind of alarm people and think, fathers just aren't involved with their children. But if you look a little bit better, they also included a measure to say, okay, so you don't live with your child, but how often do you see your child? How often do you see them? And what we find is that 3/4 of these young men still visit their children at least once a week. And most of them actually report that they see their child daily. So, it's true they're not living with their child, but one can hardly argue it, and say that the majority of fathers are not involved with their children. And moreover, the men claim that they provide, that about 61% also offer financial support. And importantly, 59% of young women agree that the men are providing financial support. So, there's also seems to actually be that these young men have not simply, impregnated these girls and sort of abandoned them and their children. They're, some of them might have. I mean, it's obviously not 100%, but we do see more male involvement if we actually look at things like contact and financial support than simply at co-residence. And this is my other bailiwick, is that, and you know all this, but really these measures of family structures based on residency need to be reconsidered also, right? And I mean, that's part of the female-headed household thing too, because it really isn't very useful, I think, really to simply say that co-residence is a proxy for childcare or child support, or really a family. We realize this more and more in Canada. We realize this, this has really probably always been the case in much of Africa, where we really do need to think of family structures, and when we're trying to describe family structures, to go beyond co-residence. So the other interesting thing is that if you look at, so why is it, what is it that determines whether or not men live with their kids, or whether or not they see their kids, or whether or not they provide child support? And the interesting thing is that if you control for dad's relationship to mom, right? Are they married? Obviously. Are they boyfriend and girlfriend? Are they casually dating? Are they, a non-serious fling, or are they an ex? And you look at the relationship status with mom, this completely determines whether or not dad lives with child, right? So, how close dad is to mom, it determines whether or not he lives with the kid. Whereas, of course, for moms, it bears no relationship whatsoever. She's going to live with that kid pretty much regardless. And in fact, what really matters for mom is whether or not she also lives with grandma. But her relationship to the man does not determine whether or not she lives with the kid, but the man's relationship to her fully determines whether or not he lives with the kid. But interestingly, it does not determine whether or not he sees the child or whether or not he provides support. So, even though it's an ex, even though it was a casual relationship, even though he only sees them as having dated, that does not determine whether or not he still maintains regular contact with the child, and it also doesn't determine whether or not he provides economic support for the child. So, yes.
I thought it was just about marriage. Now we don't hear anything. I mean, what's happening now? You changed the
Well,
topic,
these are young men and women, first of all, and second of all, we're in South Africa, and I mean, it's just marriage. It isn't over, but it is. But we do have some marriage. I don't know the percentages in this. I think it's really only about 10 to 15% of our young men who are actually married. Right. So these are young men, but it's also South Africa. Well, no, living. Yeah, right. So that also separates.
Because here in Quebec, we define marriage differently here in Quebec. We want to try to have that in Africa, So try to next time to get.
Talk more about marriage.
In South Africa, you're following in the Cape Town. It's following people from 14 to 22.
It starts 14 to 24 in 2002. So now we're 10 years out from that, right? So, they're still young by my standards, but they're not necessarily. But still, there is a lot. There have been several articles now written in from both research done around Joburg as well as Cape Town that marriage really, even living together, has really declined just dramatically in South Africa. It's
these men you are talking about.
So the men and women. So we're basically 27 to 34, right? Yeah. By the time of the last survey. So there, so some of these are married, but most of them are not married. And, and this is, I do think South Africa is very different in that dimension than most other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. What else was I going to say though? But what I will say is that the other thing is that whether or not he provides support for the kid is highly contingent on his own economic status. So whether or not he has a job, his overall levels of wealth, etc. But it has no relationship to how wealthy she is and hence her kids. So in these cases, we actually do know that the kids are living with her or not, which is very useful. So it seems not to be so much need-based as it is, ability-based on the part of the father, whether or not he provides support to her and to her kids. That's what I just said. Okay, so part of this work is actually going, there is a lot of, those are the Nairobi data. So part of this work is trying to look at kind of fathers' relationships and also trying to then, where we're going with this, is trying to look at fathers' contact over time with these kids and also see when it is in the child's life, the early life course of the child, that fathers most engage and most participate. With mothers, there's this clear, even with whether or not she lives with him, whether or not she lives with the child, there's this very clear negative relationship that as the child ages, she's less likely to live with the kid because pretty much all of them live with the kid, certainly through breastfeeding. And then over time, that deteriorates. But what's interesting with fathers, and this is what you kind of mentioned as part of the marriage process, is that actually up until about the age 10, he's continually more likely to live with his kid, right? So again, these are young men, but young men, when they first have a kid, they're very likely to live apart from their partner and their child, but they're going to continue to see the partner, they're going to continue to give support, and really they're many of the men are, this is our interpretation, trying to earn and save up enough money so that they can then build an independent household, and it's at that point that she and the child will move in with him. And so, for women, you see this decline over time with their likelihood of living with their kids, and for men, you see this very clear increase with likelihood with living with their kid. And the other things we're kind of interested in looking at is, are fathers called upon only at specific times? So maybe early in the kid's life, maybe he doesn't need to provide that much support because the kid's not going to school. And school fees seem to be very strongly associated with calling on dad, even if he's non-residential, to chip in for specific needs of the child. So it's not necessarily, in Canada, you might be obliged to pay sort of a monthly fee for, in child support, or you're obliged to pay. And it's constant throughout most of the child's life. Whereas it really seems to be very need-based for specific, the child needs to go to school or the child's sick, that fathers seem to be called upon to give financial contributions. So we're interested in kind of tracing out dad's contributions over the early life course of these kids to figure out what dads are doing. But, I do think some of this, and also some of the really compelling qualitative work from the Nairobi slums about fathers' roles, so if mom's not married, she trashes dad, all he ever gave my kids were their names, he doesn't, he's not involved, he's a drunkard, he doesn't do anything, yada, yada. But when mom's married to this guy still, she tends to give them glowing praise in the slum areas about how not only is he a great provider for the kids, but he also loves them. And he makes sure to come home in time to help them with their homework and tuck them in bed. And he, you know, provides support for them. And these sort of very tender depictions of fathers in these slum areas that we otherwise don't get, right? Like, I mean, we really, that is not an image that we have of sort of fatherhood, especially in extreme poverty, that we're also trying to bring out in sort of in some ways, a lot of this work about single motherhood being so bad, the flip side of it is saying that maybe fathers can be really good and really necessary, and for things beyond just financial support, because it may not just be about the economics of the household. It may also be about, you know, partly having a dad who then allows mom time to do more care of the kids, but also of dad himself, there for discipline, there for playing with the kids, there for helping with homework, all of these things that, I don't know, I'm really curious in your reaction. I mean, maybe we just, you know, but the reports just kind of were very tender and sweet, and, you know, and these women really felt that, you know, they would say things like, I'm very grateful to be married. It'd be so much harder to raise my kids without him. They really self-perceived that dads played a really vital role. Are we crazy?
Did you consider anything about father in your study?
In which study?
I mean, in the one on
the big one.
Yeah.
Because we know nothing. We don't. I mean, these are all women's reports. All we know is she's married or not. We have no idea from standard DHS if dad sees his kids, helps the kids, does. But we don't know that. We don't know that. If she is currently divorced, if she's currently married.
For married one, you know.
Yeah.
Married one.
If she's married, we know some things about dad. But if she's not married, and then we only know about current husband, right?
Oh, okay.
We don't know about previous husband. And if she's currently divorced, then they don't even ask them. They only ask of already married women. So, you know, it's very, you know, the DHS is very limited in providing any knowledge about these fathers, and certainly not their engagement with their children.
One of your big problems is getting
adequate. Everything telling me what my problems are. I don't know about this.
The DHS is not adequate.
No, it's not adequate.
This is a panel study, which is very, very good.
Yeah.
And you're talking about I think not the greatest demographic surveillance system, because they have huge amounts of attrition. I wonder if it would be worth, this would be a huge investment, but there are a bunch of family life surveys that were done under Philippe Antoine. All of Bilampo's thesis was on one on Burkina Faso. There was one done on Dakar. There was one done on Monaco. There was one done in Madagascar. There was, I think, one in Ivory Coast. They're all based on event history calendars. They're fairly similar information.
Are they
it would
publicly
be a
available?
royal pain to get a hold of them, and a royal pain to
So
code
why
them
is
correctly.
that? Why aren't they publicly available? Do you know, like, what?
I don't. You probably, if you know Richard Marcoux, he's probably
Okay.
most aware in Quebec of the status of these, and you know, if anybody has archived them correctly with all the. I imagine the Burkina Faso ones around, but Bilampo has already fully used it, but the other ones.
But don't
I don't
you?
know
She
if
had ties to that project, didn't she? I mean, I thought she had.
She was involved in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean,
It's accessibility problem.
Even to get the DSS data.
Exactly.
I mean, we just got comments on another paper that uses the DHS marital history data, and the reviewers are like saying, "Oh, you know, the DHS data calendar has so many limitations. Why didn't you use DSS data? Because you can't get them."
Right.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
extreme.
that's the thing. I mean, yes, they are great, but I mean, unless you are part of the team that collected them, maybe.
But no one's using those family life surveys anymore. And if they have been archived correctly, and if you're willing to
Well, if
put in
you're
the
willing to
effort-
give me contact names, I'm willing to send emails to ask. But
It's
you know, I mean, and this is part of it. And I'll also give a little plug for my data lab on life histories, HIV and health, which really focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. We do have some. You know, I also work with Simona. You know, as part of the Malawi group. There are publicly available. You know, people are starting to, but it still is a bit of a struggle getting data out there, and data that's still usable to the public, right? So the other thing with the DSS is, even if you know people, even if they want to work with you, and even the data at several of these sites is so complex, and so you have to really know what's going on to use them correctly, that it's very challenging.
And also their quality, I mean, let's not underestimate. I know quite a bit of those demographic data. They are not that, I mean, see on picture that they are good, but when you start looking at them closely,
Yeah,
there are
yeah.
major problems.
I
We're
agree.
supposed to use some of them for the committee I'm chairing at the Academy on Transition to Adult. We couldn't, on the epidemiological transition, and we hardly find very good data to inform us, in a scientific way. Of course, you have sort of basic thing, but most data are complicated, and I think we shouldn't be too scared about problems. We should be able to calibrate our estimate and say, okay, this is the confidence interval. We are not going to know the truth.
Right.
No researcher will ever know the truth, but we can actually calibrate the estimate and be prudent in interpreting the things. And that's, I think, for most part, we should actually raise the problems and sort of say these are the limitations. This is what we can do with the data. And I think Simona last week sort of touched on that, because I was coming here prepared to answer many questions, and she sort of got me to drop all of them because okay, these are the problems. I said, this is good. That's what I want to hear. So I'm saying, the data of David Lamb. This thing I know it very well, and I think there's sample attrition problem, but at the same time.
Nothing's going to be perfect.
Good.
Yeah.
They are good problems.
Yeah.
Because at least we can methodologically address them, and if you do a compelling thing, people sort of tend to say, this is what we can.
But they really go. I think they should get kudos because they go out of their way to make them, not only publicly available but fairly well documented and fairly well, clean, so at least they're usable for. And that's expensive and it's time consuming, but I think it is the kind of example that we need to set.
That's what Tom was talking about this data, but the problem we have to all work towards them is to make them accessible, because you have this data people have been collecting for the last 15 years, and when you say, can I see? But you don't even have the code book.
Right.
For 15 years, in 15 years, you can't have a code book for the data. What are you going to do with those data?
Yeah, if you really,
that's a major problem. And then you don't know the quality. We know the quality of the David Lamb data because he documented everything. And that's for us very important.
It's
but
really important. Absolutely.
We can only submit the quality, say, okay, they are good because people are following longitudinal. But when you follow longitudinal, you have also massive problems, in terms of people just say, it's the same thing. I didn't change. So you.
And a lot of it is automated systems that make automated mistakes.
Yeah.
Several of these DSS have.
And how are they being just repeated mistakes which are correlated, and then it end up giving you an outcome which is just a matter of.
It's a major problem, and I think as weak and as problematic as the DHS are, if you look at per quantity of data collected and publications out of it, they knock the DSS out of the water. The DSS, the publications out of them are trickle because it's the data are so restricted and not documented what they're doing.
The advantage of DHS to say something good, because I rarely say things good.
I know.
Is that we don't have any other data sources which can provide us with the best estimate of child mortality. That's so far. The only sources of data for national estimates across the globe in developing countries, you cannot do. The other are maybe localized, for a time period, for a limited population, for a small village, or But to get a national picture is complex and then well documented. To go through the audit. By the way, you were supposed to send to people what you presented last week.
They put it online.
No, I don't go online. Send me
an
email. Okay. Anyway.
It looks like people need to go. But thank you all for coming, and if you continue, hopefully.